Reconstruction. The ruins were vast, stretching across what had once been a bustling city. Shattered buildings leaned against one another like exhausted soldiers. Streets were fissured and half swallowed by debris, and the remnants of digital signage flickered weakly, casting fragmented light over empty plazas. Among the wreckage, a group of survivors moved carefully, their steps measured, deliberate, as if the city itself might remember their trespasses and punish them. They were a motley assembly, some weathered by time and hardship, others younger, carrying only the raw determination to endure. At the center of the group was Leora, a woman in her late 20s, whose eyes reflected both loss and tenacity. She had seen the world collapse, watched the networks fail, and felt the isolation of the enclaves multiply. Now she sought to create something new, a semblance of society from the fractured remnants of civilization. Around her, survivors argued quietly, assigning roles, sharing memories, and negotiating priorities. The air was heavy with dust and the scent of scorched metal, a constant reminder of what had been lost. They moved toward what had once been a civic square, a place where decisions had been made, orders given, and information circulated. Now it was a canvas of ruin, partially buried beneath rubble and sand. Leora knelt to inspect the remains of a data terminal, its screen shattered, but traces of stored information still lingering faintly. She touched the fragments, feeling their pulse, a heartbeat that connected past and present. Even in decay, the terminal spoke of coordination, of networks, of the potential to rebuild knowledge if one could piece it together carefully. Around her, the group set up temporary shelters, using debris, tarps, and salvaged metal sheets to create spaces of relative safety. Fires burned low, small symbols of life against the vast silence of the city. Leora moved among them, listening to stories, observing tensions, and mediating conflicts. Survival was not enough. They needed trust, direction, and a plan to avoid repeating the failures of the past. Her leadership was quiet but firm, a presence that both guided and respected the autonomy of those around her. The evening brought shadows that crept across the ruins like living things, and the survivors gathered near a low fire to share what knowledge they possessed. Maps were sketched in the dirt, supply caches noted, and routes between safe zones agreed upon. Leora encouraged the sharing of personal experiences, memories that might prove useful in anticipating challenges, recognizing threats, and preserving culture. Every anecdote, every fragment of information, became a thread in the fragile tapestry they were attempting to weave. Leora paused to examine a small capsule she had found earlier, half buried near the terminal. Inside were fragments of recorded messages, logs of decisions, and personal accounts from before the collapse. She realized the value of these remnants, guidance, warnings, and lessons that could shape their efforts. Sharing them required discretion, for not all memories were comforting, and some carried the weight of fear and regret. Yet they were essential to understanding the past and navigating the future. As night deepened, the desert wind carried faint echoes of distant collapses, the subtle hum of structures failing beyond the settlement. Leora felt the city's pulse, irregular but present, a reminder that life could persist even in fragmented form. She moved among her people, checking shelters, sharing supplies, and listening. The act of rebuilding was more than physical labor. It was the careful restoration of connection, of community, and of purpose in a landscape that had been stripped bare. She stood at the edge of the square, looking toward the horizon where the last lights of distant enclaves flickered. Somewhere out there, others survived, struggling as they did, navigating the remnants of technology, memory, and trust. The possibility of alliance, communication, or even confrontation loomed, a reminder that the world outside was unpredictable, fragmented, and potentially dangerous. Yet Leora felt the first glimmers of hope, fragile as they were, and understood that small steps, careful decisions, and shared responsibility might lay the foundation for something enduring. The fire crackled low, shadows dancing over faces marked by determination and exhaustion. Leora returned to the center of the group, surveying their tentative progress. They were beginning to recover not just space, but agency, control over their movements, knowledge, and lives. Each decision they made, each problem they solved, was a thread in the broader process of reconstruction. The city might be broken, but the survivors were not yet defeated. The next morning, the air was brittle with cold, and the desert wind carried a faint grit that stung exposed skin. Leora moved among the survivors, noting subtle shifts in attitude. Fatigue weighed heavily, and disagreements began to surface. How to allocate limited resources, which paths to explore for supplies, whom to trust with critical decisions. Even among those committed to rebuilding, the old habits of suspicion and survivalist instinct persisted. She knew that without careful mediation, these tensions could unravel the fragile cohesion they had established. Kale, a former technician, approached her with a concern. "We found a structure to the north," he said, pointing toward a ridge partially obscured by sand. "It looks intact, maybe a storage facility. Could have resources or data terminals." Leora studied the ridge in the distance. The path was risky. Sandstorms could erupt without warning, and the structure might be unstable. Yet the potential rewards were too significant to ignore. She nodded, assigning a small team to scout, emphasizing caution and the importance of documenting everything. As the team moved out, Leora returned to the group, mediating disputes that had escalated during the night. Some survivors wanted to hoard supplies, others insisted on sharing, fearing that secrecy would destroy trust. She spoke quietly but firmly, highlighting the interconnectedness of their survival. Every action taken in isolation risked undermining the entire effort. Slowly, tempers cooled, and a semblance of order returned. Hours later, the scouting team returned, carrying small but valuable findings, metal fragments, water filtration units, and a half-functional terminal. The data it contained was fragmented but illuminating. Records of previous settlements, distribution points for essential supplies, and rudimentary maps of the surrounding area. Leora examined the terminal, noting patterns and connections. Knowledge was emerging from the ruins, tentative and partial, yet enough to guide their next moves. That night, the group gathered near a makeshift fire. Leora distributed rations and relayed the findings from the scouting team. The survivors listened intently, weighing information and considering implications. Each piece of recovered knowledge offered a potential lifeline or a cautionary tale. The desert beyond was merciless, yet within this fragile camp, strategy and cooperation provided a tenuous shield. Despite the progress, unease lingered. Leora sensed the weight of responsibility pressing on her chest. Decisions she made would ripple outward, affecting not only immediate survival, but the long-term viability of the community. Every small victory, every discovery, carried the possibility of unforeseen consequences. The survivors trusted her judgment, yet she understood that leadership was as much about restraint as action, choosing when to intervene and when to let the group learn through experience. In the quiet hours, Leora reflected on the city itself. Buildings, though crumbling, hinted at past systems, remnants of a network society that had once thrived. Data nodes, partially functional, revealed glimpses of human intention, planning, coordination, adaptation. The ruins were not inert. They were records of choices, failures, and resilience. By engaging with these remnants, Leora and her group were not merely scavenging. They were interpreting history, learning from it, and shaping it into guidance for the present. As dawn approached, a sandstorm brewed on the horizon, clouds rising like dark fingers reaching across the valley. Leora observed the patterns carefully, recognizing the storm as both threat and teacher. The survivors would need to adapt, to adjust their shelters, and to protect the newly discovered capsules of data and resources. The storm symbolized the duality of their mission, danger and opportunity intertwined. Every challenge in the desert could become a lesson in survival, strategy, and cooperation. With measured steps, the group reinforced shelters, secured terminals, and organized supply caches. Leora moved among them, offering quiet guidance, ensuring that disputes remained contained. The storm was relentless, yet in their coordination, the survivors found a rhythm, a sense of purpose emerging from the chaos. The act of reconstruction had become more than physical labor. It was a test of patience, judgment, and resilience. By the afternoon, the sandstorm abated, leaving the landscape altered. Some landmarks had shifted, dunes reshaped, revealing new areas for exploration while concealing others. Leora studied the terrain, noting the changes and recalibrating plans. The survivors had weathered the storm, and their capacity to endure had been strengthened. Each obstacle overcome reinforced their ability to function as a collective, to strategize, and to maintain hope in a fractured world. Night fell, and a fragile quiet returned. Fires burned low, casting flickering shadows on faces marked by exhaustion, determination, and tentative relief. Leora walked among her people, checking shelters, examining supplies, and listening to conversations. The act of rebuilding was ongoing, iterative, and inherently uncertain. Yet even in the vast emptiness of the desert, a sense of purpose had begun to crystallize, a fragile, luminous thread connecting the ruins, the survivors, and the promise of a new beginning. The following day brought a tense stillness over the settlement. Leora led a small team toward the northern ridge, moving cautiously through the fractured streets and shifting dunes. The desert had a rhythm all its own, unpredictable yet precise, and she had learned to read its signs, the subtle changes in wind, the way sand accumulated against ruined walls, the faint vibrations beneath her boots. Each signal carried a message, a warning or a guide, and ignoring it risked disaster. The structure revealed itself gradually, half buried and leaning at a precarious angle, its metal frame twisted but intact. As they approached, Leora noted the remnants of barricades, signs of previous occupation. Someone or something had been here before, leaving traces, yet no bodies remained. She signaled for caution, instructing her team to proceed slowly, mapping the interior as they advanced. Dust and sand drifted through broken panels, obscuring details and hiding potential dangers. Inside, the space was larger than anticipated, a combination of storage and habitation. Shelving units lined the walls, containing containers, capsules, and devices of uncertain purpose. Leora examined the terminals first, noting faint power readings and data fragments preserved within memory banks. It was a repository of knowledge, incomplete yet significant. Records of supply distribution, communications logs, and maintenance protocols. She realized this could become a critical hub for the settlement, a node to coordinate recovery efforts across the fractured city. The team began cataloging supplies, metal sheets, tools, water purification units, and energy cells. Each discovery sparked a quiet sense of optimism. For the first time, they felt the potential for progress beyond mere survival. Yet with every step forward, Leora remained aware of underlying tensions. Resources, no matter how abundant, were finite. Decisions regarding allocation, leadership, and priorities had the potential to fracture their fragile cohesion. The desert had tested them once. Human conflict could undo everything faster than a sandstorm. Kale, crouched over a half-buried capsule, called her over. Inside was a set of recordings, fragments of personal diaries and operational logs. The voices were faint but distinct, speaking of fear, hope, and determination. Some entries revealed the challenges faced by previous survivors, strategies that had succeeded or failed, and warnings about relying too heavily on technology that might fail again. Leora listened carefully, absorbing each lesson, aware that these memories were both guide and caution. Back at the settlement, a subtle unrest had begun to surface. Small disputes over rations, work assignments, and access to information had grown more pronounced. Leora addressed them methodically, emphasizing transparency, collective responsibility, and the necessity of shared trust. Some accepted her guidance readily, others resisted, clinging to old survivalist instincts. She knew the task of reconstruction was as much about shaping relationships as rebuilding structures. A society could not thrive on tools alone. It required collaboration, understanding, and respect for shared purpose. As night fell, the group gathered to review their findings. Leora shared the contents of the northern structure, highlighting the potential to expand their efforts and create a more resilient community. Plans were sketched in the dirt, assigning teams to resource management, exploration, and information preservation. The survivors spoke less of immediate survival and more of strategy, a subtle but crucial shift. They were beginning to think not just in hours, but in days, weeks, and months, a sign of emerging foresight and coordination. Leora moved among the group, noting the way people interacted, offering encouragement, and quietly addressing friction before it escalated. Her presence was steady, an anchor amid uncertainty. She understood that her role was not to dominate, but to facilitate, to help them see possibilities while respecting their agency. The desert could teach harsh lessons, but leadership required balancing authority with trust, guidance with freedom. Outside, the wind shifted, scattering fine particles across the square and carrying distant echoes of collapsing structures. The sound was a reminder that their world remained fragile and unpredictable. Yet within the group, a sense of determination had begun to solidify. Each discovery, each decision, each careful negotiation contributed to a growing sense of purpose. They were building more than shelters. They were building resilience, knowledge, and the foundations of a functioning society. By the time the fire burned low, Leora returned to her post atop a low ridge overlooking the settlement. She watched the desert, the ruined city, and the tentative signs of life coalescing into a fragile but enduring pattern. The capsules and terminals they had recovered pulsed faintly, symbols of memory and knowledge that had survived the blackout. They were the skeleton of a new order, fragile yet vital. The night was silent but pregnant with potential. Leora knew challenges awaited, storms, scarcity, and the ever-present uncertainty of human behavior. But she also knew that the survivors had begun to internalize a shared vision. Reconstruction was no longer merely a dream. It was a deliberate, collective effort. And for the first time in a long while, hope felt tangible, grounded in the choices they had made and the lessons they had preserved. Dawn crept across the ruins, casting fractured light over tents and makeshift shelters. Leora walked among the survivors, noting subtle changes since the storm and the northern structure's discovery. Confidence was building, tentative but undeniable. Faces that had been etched with fatigue and suspicion now carried a quiet determination. They were no longer merely surviving. They were beginning to shape a future, however fragile. The northern structure became the heart of their settlement. Capsules and terminals were carefully catalogued, forming a network of preserved knowledge. Each fragment carried the weight of lives lost, choices made, and lessons learned. Leora held a small capsule in her hand, listening to its faint echoes. Voices long gone spoke of mistakes and triumphs alike, guiding her decisions. It was a reminder that memory, human, technological, or both, was the foundation of the civilization they sought to rebuild. Yet not all was harmonious. Disagreements still flared over priorities and distribution, subtle clashes over leadership and resources. Leora intervened when necessary, but she allowed the group to exercise judgment and autonomy. They were learning the balance between cooperation and individuality. And in these small, tense negotiations, society itself was being reassembled. Every compromise and concession was a stitch in the fabric of a new community. By mid-afternoon, a group of scouts returned from a distant ridge. They brought news of other survivors, small clusters struggling across the desert, some hostile, others wary but curious. Leora considered the implications. Alliance could strengthen their settlement, provide new knowledge, and offer trade. But risk was inevitable. Trust was a currency as rare and volatile as water in the desert. Decisions would have consequences, not all predictable, and she felt the weight of responsibility settle heavier with each passing moment. The survivors gathered that evening for a council. Around the fire, plans were debated, mapped, and recorded. Leora guided the discussion with patience, allowing voices to be heard, yet shaping the decisions toward practicality and survival. A sense of ritual emerged: discussion, deliberation, action. Even the youngest participants found roles, small but significant, in maintaining shelters, rationing supplies, or monitoring the terminals. Purpose became communal, a shared lifeline against the chaos outside. Night fell, and the desert cooled, shadows stretching across the ruins. Leora climbed a low ridge overlooking the settlement. From this vantage, she saw the interplay of light and shadow, tents flickering with firelight, the faint glow of terminals, and the scattered figures of survivors moving with purpose. The city was broken, yet it breathed in its own strange rhythm. She could feel it, the pulse of reconstruction, fragile and uneven but undeniable. In that quiet, Leora reflected on what they had achieved. They had survived storms, navigated treacherous terrain, and recovered fragments of knowledge that might have been lost forever. Yet survival was no longer their sole measure. They were learning to coordinate, to plan, to communicate. Trust and accountability were being rebuilt alongside walls and shelters. Memory had become both tool and guide, a reminder that the past, though shattered, was not entirely lost. A distant howl carried on the wind, a reminder of the desert's indifference. Leora felt the weight of vigilance, but also of possibility. The survivors were resilient, capable of growth, and aware that reconstruction was ongoing, iterative, and never complete. Every decision, every exploration, every shared lesson was part of the foundation for something larger. And though the future remained uncertain, they were no longer passive. They were actors in a story they were beginning to write together. She returned to the central camp, the firelight catching the lines of determination on her face. Around her, the group rested, some tending to supplies, others reviewing maps and terminals, and a few simply watching the flickering flames. Leora's gaze lingered on the capsules she had catalogued, echoes of countless lives preserved against the erasure of time. They were a bridge between memory and action, past and present, loss and hope. As the night deepened, she allowed herself a quiet thought. Reconstruction was not merely about rebuilding structures or recovering data. It was about restoring agency, identity, and connection. It was about teaching the survivors that the choices they made today would shape the society of tomorrow. And in that, there was both power and peril. The desert remained indifferent, yet within the fragile enclave, the human spirit asserted itself. The fire burned low, embers glowing like small stars against the darkness. Leora stepped back, letting the group operate within the systems they were creating, a delicate balance of guidance and freedom. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, sandstorms, resource shortages, and perhaps encounters with distant survivors. But for the first time, hope felt earned, grounded in action and understanding. They were building more than shelters. They were building a society, one careful decision at a time. And as the desert wind whispered through the ruins, carrying with it the echoes of past civilizations and the faint promise of future ones, Leora understood. Reconstruction was never complete. It was ongoing, relentless, and essential. In every choice, every lesson preserved, every connection forged, the survivors took another step toward enduring amidst chaos. The city remained fractured, but its people were learning to endure, to remember, and to create. The story of their survival was only beginning.